In the fading light of an autumn sky, her people carried her into the ravine. Once a warrior, once a wife, she now lay broken, both legs lost to the clash of rifles and steel. They left her with a dying fire, a braid for farewell, and nothing more. Alone beneath the wind, she was meant to vanish into silence. But fate is a stubborn rider, and before the ashes turned cold, a cowboy appeared on the horizon. The dusk of late autumn settled over the land like a burial shroud, heavy and unmoving. The cottonwoods by the river rattled with brittle leaves, and a sharp wind slid down from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of snow yet to fall. In a narrow ravine, where the earth folded into itself like a scar, a group of figures moved silently. They were Apache, their faces set like stone, their shadows long against the last light. At their center was a woman once known for her strength. Nalin had ridden beside hunters, had carried a rifle as though it were an extension of her arm. She had been a wife, a companion, and a warrior. But now she was broken. Her legs, once swift and sure, had been taken in a clash with soldiers weeks before. What remained of them was bound in rough cloth, still seeping red through the stitches. She was alive, but in the eyes of her people, she was already half gone. They carried her down into the ravine, not speaking. The air itself seemed to recoil, as though it, too, wished to turn away from the act that was about to unfold. At the base of the gully they lowered her to the ground. One of the women struck a small fire, feeding it with dry twigs until it gave off a pale, shivering light. It was not warmth enough for winter, not a blaze fit to protect. It was a token flame, a symbol of farewell. Nalin's younger sister knelt beside her. Without a word, she drew the long black strands of Nalin's hair into her hands and began to braid. Each pass of the hair between her fingers was a memory, childhood games by the river, laughter in springtime, the sound of hoofbeats across summer grass. When the braid was tied with a strip of deerskin, the sister placed it gently across Nalin's chest. Her eyes were wet, but she did not speak. None of them did. Then, as dusk deepened into night, they rose. The men looked away, ashamed. The women whispered prayers to guide Nalin's spirit. And one by one, they departed, their silhouettes climbing the ridge, fading against the bruised horizon. When the last figure vanished, the night closed in with a merciless silence. Nalin lay still beside the flickering flame. She did not cry out. Her people had done what they believed was right, sparing the tribe from the burden of a body they could not feed through the coming winter. Yet the wound they left was deeper than her torn flesh. It was the wound of being cast away, of no longer belonging. She listened to the wind in the ravine and thought of the river, of her husband whose grave was marked by stones, of the wedding dress of deerskin she had once stitched, now perhaps gathering dust in some forgotten chest. Sleep came only in fragments. Pain gnawed at her, hunger tightened her belly, and the cold pressed in. But through it all, she refused to let her spirit slip. Something inside her burned still, not hope, not exactly, but a refusal to surrender. By morning the fire had dwindled to ash. Frost rimed the grasses, and the world felt brittle, as though it might shatter with a touch. That was when the sound of hooves came, soft but steady. Thomas Everett rode slowly along the ridge above the ravine, his eyes scanning the brush for strayed cattle. He was a tall man, weathered by wind and sun, the sort of figure who looked as if the land itself had carved him. His coat was worn at the shoulders, his hat pulled low. He had been alone for 3 years now, ever since the fever had taken his wife. Loneliness clung to him like a second skin, though he never spoke of it. He lived by quiet labor, by the rhythm of chores and the silence of nights broken only by the creak of a rocking chair. When he looked down into the ravine and saw her, his first thought was to ride on. It was not his burden, not his fight. She was Apache, and he had lost enough to their raids in years past, just as they had lost enough to men like him. The world was divided, and a man did not step carelessly across such lines. But then he caught her gaze. Even through the shadow of hunger and exhaustion, her eyes held a fierce ember, neither begging nor broken, but alive, unwilling to bow to death. It stopped him as surely as a bullet to the chest. He sat there on his horse for a long moment, the reins loose in his hands. He told himself to leave, to let the land take its due. But his hands betrayed him. He dismounted, boots crunching in the frost, and descended into the ravine. She spoke when he drew near, her words low but edged with defiance. He did not understand them all, but the meaning was plain enough: leave me. Let me go as my people intended. Thomas crouched beside her, studying the ruin of her legs, the stubborn line of her mouth. He shook his head slowly. No, he murmured, though she could not understand the word. With care that surprised even him, he slid his arms beneath her frail frame and lifted her. She resisted at first, her fist striking weakly against his chest, but he held fast. He carried her up the slope, each step deliberate, until they reached his horse. Settling her across the saddle, he mounted behind, steadying her with one arm as the horse turned toward the horizon. The wind pressed cold against them as they rode, carrying the scent of pine and frost. Behind them, the ravine and its token fire faded into distance. Ahead lay Thomas's cabin, a lonely shape at the foot of the hills. Neither spoke. Yet in the silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not trust, not yet. But the faint, uneasy tremor of a chance, an unwanted, unlooked-for chance, that neither could quite deny. Thomas's cabin clung to the edge of the foothills like a weathered sentinel, its timbers groaning in the wind that swept down from the mountains. Built by his own hands years ago, it bore the marks of time and solitude: a sagging porch rail, a roof patched in places with mismatched shingles, and smoke rising from a chimney blackened with countless winters' worth of fire. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, coffee grounds, and the faint trace of old tobacco. It was here that Thomas carried Nalin. He set her carefully on the narrow bed nearest the hearth, its quilt faded but clean, stitched long ago by his wife. He drew the heavy wool blankets up around her shoulders and stepped back, watching. Her breathing was shallow, her lips pale. Yet her eyes opened to the crackling fire, and for a moment her gaze wandered the small room as though measuring its walls. She lay apart from him, yet not so far that he could not hear the faint sound of her breath. The cabin was small, their lives would now unfold in proximity neither had sought. Thomas busied himself with chores, pulling off his gloves, stacking wood by the door, setting water to boil. He moved with the silence of a man long accustomed to speaking only to himself. In the nights that followed, as her wounds began slowly to knit, silence filled the cabin like another presence. But silence was not emptiness, it carried memory. For Nalin, the firelight played tricks, casting shadows that pulled her back into other seasons. She remembered the weight of a rifle in her arms, the steady gallop of a horse beneath her, the exhilaration of wind and freedom. She remembered kneeling beside her husband years before, braiding her hair while he polished his weapon, both preparing for what battles the day might bring. A wedding dress of soft deerskin had once been hers, stitched with beads in turquoise and red, each one a prayer. That dress now seemed like the skin of another woman altogether, a spirit she had shed along with her Lul. At times, in the half-light of sleep, she saw again the faces of her tribe as they turned from her, the sorrow in her sister's eyes, the relief in others. In those dreams she tried to call after them, but her voice carried no sound. She awoke each time with her braid still pressed against her chest like a remnant of belonging she could not throw away. Thomas, too, carried shadows. Each night, after the cabin quieted, he settled into the rocking chair by the fire. Its wood creaked with every shift of his weight, a sound that had once been a comfort when his wife sat across from him with her sewing. Now it was a reminder of absence. 3 winters had passed since fever carried her away. He had dug her grave beneath the cottonwoods near the creek, marking the place with river stones. Sometimes, when the wind came low and mournful, he could almost hear her voice in the branches. The quilt on the bed was hers, the chipped mug he still drank coffee from had once been hers. And now this stranger, an Apache woman with eyes that spoke of suffering he barely understood, lay wrapped in those remnants. Confusion pressed on him. He had brought her here out of something he could not name, but he wrestled with it. Was it pity? Was it guilt? Or was it some stubborn instinct against letting death claim another soul before its time? He did not know. All he knew was that each night, as the fire glowed low, he felt the weight of two griefs filling the cabin, his own and hers. Days passed in this rhythm. Thomas tended to the livestock, chopped wood, and returned each evening to find her watching the flames. Nalin, though weakened, began to help in small ways, shelling beans, mending a strap with deft fingers, whispering old songs under her breath when she thought he could not hear. Their words to one another were few, for their languages diverged. Yet in silence, gestures spoke, the way he set a steaming bowl near her hand without ceremony, the way she folded the quilt with precision after resting. One evening, as the wind pressed hard against the shutters, Thomas sat in his chair, staring at the fire as he always did. His thoughts wandered to his wife's laughter, a sound nearly faded from memory. Nalin, half dreaming on the bed, watched him. The lines of grief on his face were as clear as scars. In him she saw her own loneliness mirrored, two lives abandoned in different ways, yet bound by the same emptiness. Neither spoke. Yet something shifted, a recognition unspoken but undeniable. Survival was more than tending wounds or keeping hunger at bay. Survival was holding dignity, memory, and spirit together in the face of loss. In the stillness, the fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the chimney's throat. Thomas rocked once, the chair creaking. Nalin closed her eyes and listened to the sound. For the first time since the ravine, her breath eased as though the silence around her did not cut so sharply. The first snow came like a whisper, dusting the foothills with pale frost that clung to branches and rooftops. Thomas had seen winters crueler than this one, but he knew the mountains well enough to recognize the warning. When the wind shifted, sharp with a bite from the north, he muttered under his breath and checked the shutters. By afternoon, the whisper had grown to a roar. Clouds piled black and heavy against the sky, their bellies swollen with snow. The storm came suddenly, as if the heavens had opened a gate, and the world was swallowed in white. Wind shrieked against the cabin walls, rattling loose boards, and snow drove in waves so thick the nearby pines vanished. Inside, the cabin became both sanctuary and prison. Thomas moved quickly, his boots thudding against the floorboards as he gathered wood, checked the roof beams, and prepared lanterns. Each gust pressed against the shutters with the force of a fist, and still he worked steadily, calm as a man accustomed to labor in silence. Nalin lay beneath her blankets, watching him. Though her body weakened easily, her hands sought purpose. She would not let herself be only a burden. She asked for leather straps, and when he placed them before her, she began braiding with careful precision, repairing tack frayed by long use. Her fingers moved like they remembered better days, when she had braided hair and reins with the same skill. Thomas said little. He moved from fire to window, from door to table, carrying out the rhythm of survival. But when she placed the finished strap on the table with a quiet nod, he paused long enough to meet her eyes. He returned the nod, a wordless acknowledgement that her labor mattered. Night deepened, and the storm did not relent. Wind screamed across the chimney, and snow piled against the door. The cabin shook with each gust. Thomas sat by the fire at last, pulling a worn Bible from the shelf. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed from years of use. He did not open it to preach, faith had long ago soured into something quieter, something private. He read aloud because the sound of a voice was a shield against the storm's howl. His words filled the cabin, low and steady. Verses rose and fell like the rhythm of hoofbeats, not lofty but grounding. Nalin listened without interruption, the cadence unfamiliar but comforting in its persistence. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her like the warmth of the fire. When Thomas faltered, his voice rough with fatigue, silence settled thick again. But then Nalin, her voice scarcely louder than the crackle of embers, began to hum. It was an old Apache lullaby, one her mother had sung when she was a child, a song that carried the cadence of rivers and wind through canyon walls. Her tone wavered at first, but grew steadier as memory guided her. Thomas did not understand the words, but he felt their weight. The two sounds, his scripture and her song, wove together in memory, not in harmony, yet not in discord either. For a moment, the storm seemed distant, held at bay by two griefs that crossed in need. The days stretched long within the storm. Thomas rose before dawn, forcing the door against drifts to feed the livestock, his figure swallowed by snow before the cabin swallowed him back. He returned with frost clinging to his beard and lashes, his shoulders sagging with the toll of work that never ended. Each time he entered, Nalin saw more clearly the measure of his endurance, a man who asked nothing yet carried everything. She answered as best she could. She kept the fire alive when his hands were numb, stirring the embers with iron tongs. She prepared food from what stores he had, boiling beans and meat, portioning carefully so nothing was wasted. She mended what small tools she could reach. Pride ached in her chest, but pride softened into gratitude. One evening, he returned late, his steps heavier than usual, a bundle of kindling on his back. Frost glittered in his beard, his hands raw from cold. She saw in him not the stern silence of a captor, but the unspoken devotion of a man who shielded more than himself. She reached for the blanket at her side, pulled it close, and when he set the wood by the fire, she held it out toward him. At first he hesitated, unused to being cared for. Then, without a word, he sat near and let the warmth seep into his bones. Their eyes met across the fire, a silent exchange, "You endure for me, and I see it." The storm raged for 3 days. When it finally broke, the world outside was muffled in white silence. Snow drifts rose taller than fences, and icicles hung heavy from the eaves. But the cabin still stood, and its fire still burned. Thomas shoveled a path to the barn while Nalin watched from the window. His figure cut against the bright snow, strong and solitary, but not untouched by the burdens he bore. For the first time, she felt the stir of something that was not merely survival. It was trust, fragile but real, rooting itself in the soil of shared storms. That night, when he returned, shoulders slumped and face raw with wind, she whispered a word in her language, small, nearly lost in the crackle of fire. It meant shield. He did not understand, but he saw the way she looked at him, and in her gaze, he recognized the truth. The storm had tested them, each in their own way. And though the snow would melt and the winds would quiet, the greater storm lay within, the storm of loneliness, memory, and grief. Yet they had endured it together. When the storm at last broke and spring's thaw began, the land shifted from silence to sound. Snowmelt poured down gullies and carved silver threads through the earth. Birds returned to the trees, their calls sharp against the still chill mornings. For Thomas and Nalin, the cabin that had been refuge during winter became again a dwelling bound by chores and distance, and by the tension that grew as her strength began, little by little, to return. She had learned to prop herself upright with the aid of crutches Thomas had shaped from ash wood, their surfaces smoothed by his knife. Though grateful in some quiet part of her heart, she hated them. Each thud of the crutch against the floor reminded her of what she had lost. Each step Thomas took past the window, splitting wood or carrying buckets, struck her like a lash. She could not bear the sound of his axe, its rhythm steady as a heartbeat, when her own legs could carry her nowhere. Her pride, still sharp as flint, flared hot. One evening she told him, her voice taut as a bowstring, to leave her in the woods where she might finish her life with dignity. Her words were broken in English, but her meaning was clear enough. Thomas, wiping sweat from his brow, only shook his head. His refusal came without anger, without debate. "No," was all he said, the word heavy as iron. That answer kindled fire in her chest. She struck the floor with her crutch, eyes bright with rage. "I am not child," she spat. "I am warrior. Let me die with sky above me." Thomas said nothing more. He returned to his chair by the fire, rocking slowly, his silence thicker than any argument. His grief had made him stubborn, He knew the language of loss, and he would not let her walk into it willingly. His very refusal was an act of defiance, against her death, against his own loneliness. The air between them grew taut in those days, stretched near breaking. Yet life has a way of pressing forward regardless. Seeds of grass sprouted, streams ran free again, and with spring's thaw came visitors. One late afternoon, as the sun dropped low and painted the sky with copper light, the sound of hooves carried up the valley. Thomas stepped outside, rifle slung loosely at his side, and saw 3 ranchers approaching. Neighbors of a kind, though not companions. They reined up before his porch, dust rising around their horses. Their eyes moved past him, through the open door, and fixed on the figure of Nalin by the hearth. Their mouths curled in sneers. One muttered about raids, another about scalps taken. They warned him in tones meant to sound like neighborly advice but sharp with threat. A man who sheltered an Apache would find no welcome at the trading post, no trust at the saloon, no safety should trouble ride. Thomas listened, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. When they had finished, he gave no defense, no plea, not even a rebuke. He only stood in silence, his rifle resting easy in his hand, his gaze steady. After a long moment, the ranchers shifted in their saddles, muttered curses, and turned their horses back down the trail. Nalin had watched from the window, her hands clenched around her crutches. Their words, though not all understood, carried enough venom to pierce her. She had seen such hatred before, on other faces. What startled her was not their contempt but Thomas's silence. He had let them go without word or excuse, bearing their judgment like a man who had already chosen where he stood. That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever. Thomas sat in his rocking chair, rifle across his knees, the firelight cutting his face into lines of shadow and flame. He did not look at her, but his very stillness told her what he carried, the knowledge that he had set himself apart from his own people to shelter her. Nalin studied him in silence. In him she saw a mirror of her own fate, cast out, set apart, bearing the weight of exile not by choice but by consequence. Yet unlike her tribe, he had not turned away. His protection was not demanded, nor spoken, nor even explained. It was simply given, and in its giving lay a form of love neither of them dared name. Her pride still burned, her suspicion still lingered. Gratitude warred with anger, trust with fear. Yet in that firelit moment, with the shadows of rifles and rocking chairs, of braids and old scars, she understood something she had not before, that survival was no longer only her own struggle. It was his as well. And in some unspoken bond, they bore it together. Spring swept over the land like a breath long held and finally released. Grass rose green across the plains, whispering when the wind passed through. The air smelled of thawed earth, of water freed from ice, of beginnings that came whether men desired them or not. Calves bawled in distant pastures, and the sky held a blue so bright it ached to look at. In Thomas's valley, the cabin still stood, weathered yet strong. Smoke curled from its chimney in thin ribbons. The axe's rhythm had quieted now that wood was well stocked. Nalin had taken to sitting by the open door, crutches leaning against the frame, her eyes drawn often to the wide stretch of land. She watched the season awaken with a longing that was part memory, part ache. It was on one such morning that a lone rider appeared. Dust rose behind him as his horse picked its way along the ridge. Nalin's heart stopped as recognition seized her. He was of her tribe, a cousin once close in childhood. He dismounted when he saw her, his face carved with both relief and disapproval. They spoke in low tones, the language flowing quick between them. His words cut deep. She should not be here, he said. To stay with a white man was to endanger him and dishonor herself. Rumors of her survival had already reached the ears of warriors and settlers alike. Blood followed such stories. She was a spark too near dry grass. Nalin lowered her gaze, shame warring with longing. The tribe that had abandoned her now warned her not to belong elsewhere. Old wounds, half-healed, tore open again. When the cousin mounted to ride away, she felt torn in two. The pull of her people's memory and the shelter of this place where a man who owed her nothing had not turned her out. That night, silence weighed heavy in the cabin. Thomas sensed her unrest though he asked no questions. He sat at the table mending a harness, while she turned the braid in her hands like a talisman. Between them, the fire glowed steady, its warmth binding two restless spirits in uneasy peace. But peace seldom lingers long in such lands. It came after midnight, when the world lay hushed. The sound of horses shattered the quiet, more than one, their hooves dull against the softened ground. Thomas rose at once, rifle in hand, his eyes narrowing. Bandits, drawn by rumor of his cattle and land. They came with shouts and gunfire, circling the cabin like wolves. Glass shattered as a bullet struck the window frame. Smoke from the hearth mingled with the acrid sting of powder. Thomas returned fire from the doorway, his shots measured, steady. Nalin, heart pounding, pulled herself from the bed and dragged the rifle box to her side. Though her legs failed her, her will did not. She worked with calm hands, loading rifles, passing them to Thomas with sharp commands in broken English and Apache alike. Higher. Left. Wait. Her voice carried the tone of a warrior, crisp and unyielding. The cabin trembled with the exchange. Muzzle flashes lit the night outside, shadows leaping across the walls. Bullets thudded into logs, splinters flying. Yet side by side, they held. Thomas fired with the precision of a hunter, each shot deliberate, while Nalin's hands kept the rhythm unbroken, her words guiding him through the smoke. At last, the attackers faltered. Two horses bolted into the darkness, their riders cursing. A final shout carried into the night, and then only silence remained, silence and the reek of powder lingering like a bitter perfume. Thomas lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. Sweat and soot streaked his face. Turning, he found Nalin slumped against the wall, her hands raw from the work of reloading. A cut traced her temple where glass had flown. He crossed to her at once, kneeling, his hands trembling as they brushed the wound. His touch was hesitant, reverent, as though afraid that in mending her he might break something sacred. She did not flinch. Their eyes met in the fire's afterglow, two souls scarred by loss yet alive by the other's will. No vows were spoken. No promises bound them. Yet in that hush after violence, when the firelight flickered across their faces, they knew what words could not name. They had fought together, endured together, and neither had abandoned the other. Thomas wrapped her wound with a strip of cloth, his fingers lingering longer than necessity demanded. Nalin, exhausted, let her head rest briefly against his shoulder. For once, she did not resist his nearness. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and smoke, but within its walls burned something new. Not pity, not obligation, but chosen loyalty, born in the fire between them, stronger for the trial they had shared. Summer came soft and golden, carrying with it the smell of sage and sun-warmed grass. The snow that once hemmed them in had long melted, giving way to rolling fields where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. Crickets sang in the dusk, meadowlarks in the dawn. The land, which had tested them with storm and hunger, now stretched wide in quiet abundance, as though it too had survived and breathed easier. Nalin had grown stronger with the season. Though her legs remained absent, the crutches Thomas fashioned from ash would have become extensions of her will. She moved with steadier rhythm each day, her body hardened again by necessity, her spirit no longer bent under the weight of helplessness. Each morning she braided her hair with a new deliberation, not as a relic of farewell but as a mark of persistence, threads binding past to present, sorrow to strength. It was she who first insisted on the ride. The hills called to her, the open sky pulling at her chest like an old song. Thomas resisted at first, wary of her balance, wary too of what dangers might wait beyond the safety of his fields. Yet in the end he yielded, fashioning a saddle with straps and padding, steadying her as she settled onto the horse's back. His hand remained near the reins, but her pride held firm. They rode slow across the meadows, grass brushing their boots, cicadas humming in the heat. Thomas's gelding plodded patiently, while the mare beneath Nalin bore her with gentle strength. Side by side they climbed toward the ridge, pausing often to let the horses breathe. The land spread out below them like a great woven cloth, stitched with rivers and trees, hemmed by mountains pale with distance. It was along the trail that they met the ranchers. The same men who had once ridden up to Thomas's cabin with sneers now came with lowered eyes. Word of the bandit fight had traveled fast. What they had mocked as folly, harboring a woman cast off by her people, they now named courage. Their leader muttered an apology, rough and halting, as though the words themselves tasted foreign. Thomas said little, only tipped his hat. But Nalin, watching, saw the shift. Justice had come not through bullets or vengeance, but through endurance, through the quiet strength of two lives bound together against the storm. Respect, hard-earned, had replaced derision. When at last they reached the ridge, the world seemed to open around them. Wind pressed cool against their faces. The sky was wide, endless, a vault of light. Nalin asked Thomas to halt, and there she took a strip of leather from her pocket, weaving her braid anew. Each twist of hair was steady, deliberate, symbolic. She had once worn her braids as a farewell when her tribe abandoned her. Now she wove them not for ending, but for beginning. She spoke softly then, her eyes on the horizon. She told him she could not return to her people, the wound of abandonment ran too deep, and the choice to live beyond them had already been made. Nor could he return to the life he had lost, the wife beneath the cottonwoods, the home that once was. But perhaps, she said, between the ruins of what had been, something new could be built. A life neither had imagined, but both had earned. Thomas listened in silence, his jaw tight, his hands resting on the saddle horn. The wind pulled at his hat brim, tugged at the loose strands of her hair. At length he nodded, not quick, not eager, but slow and firm, the gesture of a man who did not make promises lightly. His gaze, when it met hers, carried the weight of a vow without words. They turned their horses homeward as the sun dipped low, setting fire to the horizon. The ride down was quiet, each lost in thought yet bound by the closeness of shared direction. The prairie wind moved around them, sighing like a benediction. When at last the cabin came into view, smoke rising from its chimney, it no longer looked a place of exile. The rough-hewn walls, the rocking chair on the porch, the field stretching beyond, these things, once symbols of loneliness, now seemed like the framework of belonging. Thomas dismounted first, steadying the mare as Nalin slid carefully down. He held her crutches ready, though she leaned on him longer than necessity required. Together they crossed the threshold as evening shadows lengthened, the fire within casting its warm glow against the shutters. Inside, the familiar creak of the rocking chair filled the hush. Nalin lowered herself into its embrace, the wood worn smooth beneath her hands. Thomas moved about the room, stirring the fire, setting the kettle to boil. The rhythm of his presence, once foreign, had become as natural as breath. The firelight caught her face as she watched him. It traced the scar at her temple, the determination in her eyes. It softened the harsh lines of his grief, the wear of years upon his brow. Two souls, scarred but unbroken, had found one another not by design, but by endurance, by the refusal to surrender to abandonment. Outside, the prairie stretched infinite and untamed, the wind carrying with it the voices of those who had gone before. Yet within those walls, there was peace. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady and enduring, like the quiet flame that warms without consuming. They had no need for words. The silence spoke enough, of burdens carried, of storms survived, of the unspoken promise that though the world might abandon them, they would not abandon each other. And as the night deepened, the rocking chair creaked in its slow, steady rhythm, echoing like a heartbeat beneath the song of the prairie wind.